So, wir würden gerne
So,
weitermachen.
we would like to continue now.
Ich habe mir wieder Gäste
I
eingeladen.
have guests here with me again, two young ladies who will introduce themselves and who will then tell you what the next item on our agenda is.
Hallo. Hallo,
Hello,
hallo, mein Name ist Emily. Jetzt kommt
my name is Henry Lifcut, and you're going to hear Tim now, and David, and Shanti, and I'm 15 years old.
Hallo, ich bin
Hi,
Isabel.
I'm Isabel.
Ich bin 12.
I'm 12 years old, and I'll be turning 13 soon. And next,
Tim,
you will hear Tim, David, and Shanti.
Thank you.
These are the best introductions anywhere. I just love this. I don't know why we can't get the other associations to do it for their conferences, but they don't. Welcome back. That was a good long lunch break, so you've had a chance to eat and take a nap and whatever else. I wanted to say something about the PowerPoint slide before we begin. This is what we've adopted for my research lab at Central Michigan University, but we really wanted a logo for the lab. So 2 years ago, after this conference, Shanti and my wife and one of my other students went down to Heidelberg and stayed with Julia Benson and Lavinia. And Lavinia at that time was doing lots of sketching, and we said, Lavinia, would you draw something for our lab logo? And that's what she drew. We love it. We just think it's the best logo ever for a research lab.
Is that you?
I don't know who represents, but people tell me it's probably me. Got the glasses. But there's a German connection, permanent German connection to my research lab, and I think you should all know that and appreciate that. The genesis for this presentation was several years ago when the Australians wanted something kind of like this. But there's been a huge discussion in, I call it charge land, about various mental illness conditions that people believe are associated with CHARGE syndrome. And it honestly breaks my heart when I see on Facebook someone saying, well, we found out that my daughter not only has CHARGE, but also has autism and has obsessive-compulsive disorder and has Tourette syndrome and on and on and on. And I think, no, you don't. Your daughter doesn't have all those things. Your daughter has CHARGE syndrome. I've spent the last 25 years or so trying to convince the medical profession that we are not doing anybody a good service by labeling our kids with CHARGE with autism. They do not have autism. They have CHARGE. And so I wanted to develop a presentation, and along with David and Shanti, about why these mental illness disorders are better described by the characteristics of CHARGE syndrome than people with CHARGE having something else. So that's the focus for the next hour and a half. Then after break, we're going to come and talk about interventions that we think we should be considering to help alleviate some of the symptoms that we see that might look like a mental illness condition, but we don't believe really are. So, this is my son Jacob. Looks autistic, doesn't he? He looks actually pretty green. Somebody said yesterday that you know, you can't mess up with finger paints. Actually, I beg to differ. But Jacob likes to paint himself anyway. He used to paint himself with feces, but he doesn't do that anymore. And if it's just finger paints, I'm happy. Right? This is good. The only thing that worries me is that several years ago, Jacob learned how to croak like a frog, and I can't produce it myself, but it's very clear, and he's very skilled, and I haven't met anybody else who actually could do it. And then a while ago, we were taking a hike in a park, and Jacob was on his bicycle, a very adaptive bicycle, and he was going. So I think he's morphing into a frog. But he does not have autism, all right? I get worried about piling on diagnoses on top of diagnoses. I mean, it's like, I just feel it in my shoulders and my back. It was like, okay, I've got CHARGE syndrome. Oh, now I've got autism. And now I've got OCD. And I mean, come on. We don't need that, especially when it's totally inappropriate. I mean, you can add these on. And the point we're going to be making here is, sure, if you don't consider CHARGE syndrome and you only look at what the kid's doing, all right, so call them autistic, but they just don't happen to be. There's so many problems with these diagnoses. One is they create a reality which may not exist. I mean, as soon as you say, David Brown has autism, he probably doesn't. But as soon as you say that, you create this whole kind of understanding you think you have about, oh, he's got autism. And this whole world opens up about what you think autism is from what you've read in magazines and what you've seen on television. You think you got understood. And at that point, you've got this whole new reality around this person. Does it really exist? Why are they suddenly a different human being? They're not. It also doesn't explain anything. So, well, Tim, why does David have autism? Well, have you looked at how he behaves? Yeah, we're wondering why he behaves that way. Because he has autism. Oh, and it goes around and around, autism behavior, and it doesn't get you anywhere. It doesn't explain anything. It's a word that you put on to a set of behaviors. It also ignores what's unique about each individual's behavior. I belong to the Society for the Study of Behavioral Phenotypes. Sounds very impressive. I didn't know what behavioral phenotypes were until my friend from Australia introduced me to a bunch of medical people as Tim studies the behavioral phenotype of CHARGE syndrome. I thought, oh, that's what I do. I didn't know. But then I joined the society, and but it's looking at how and by the way, this all came from parents. It started in England, and the psychiatrists in England noticed the parents of children with Cru-de-Chac syndrome or Cornelia de Lange syndrome or Fragile X syndrome were describing behaviors that were very similar within those syndromes. And I thought what we need to do is identify what are the unique set of behaviors associated with specific and distinct genetic syndromes. So what's unique about CHARGE behavior, which makes it different from the behavior associated with Prader-Willi syndrome, for example. And as soon as you say they have autism, we stop looking for what's unique in the behavior. And when we can't describe the behavior in its uniqueness, we can't figure out what to do about it. We can't understand it because it's just become a labeled behavior. And then it also leads to multiple drug treatments. And I have seen so many children on so many medications. The worst I actually personally heard was in Orlando last year for the CHARGE syndrome in the US, where a person came up and said, we have a girl that's on our caseload that we work with. She's on 12 different psychotropic medications, 12 different medications to control her behavior. I said, she must be like a zombie. And they said, no, actually, she's completely out of control. And all they've done is added drug after drug after drug to try to control her behavior. And so now she's on 12 of them. That made me cry, literally. I just can't stand the idea of what they're doing to that poor woman's brain. It's unconscionable. So What are these mental disorders? There's a lot of confusion about what mental disorders are and how they're diagnosed. And actually, one of the reasons for the confusion is that nobody really knows. There are no blood tests for these things. You know, if you think you got schizophrenia, go get a blood test. No, there's no blood test, right? We can't tell whether a person really has autism or has something different because there's no blood test. There's no diagnostic mechanism that will tell you definitively that they have that. All the diagnoses within the mental health, mental illness area are based on symptom covariation. That means several symptoms seem to occur together more often than you would expect. A simple way to think about symptom covariation is that if you had a runny nose and a cough and a scratchy throat, you might say, oh, I have a cold, or you have allergies, but you put these symptoms together and say, when a person experiences those sets of things, then they have a cold, right? Well, we do the same thing in mental illness. If you show these sets of behaviors, we are going to call you whatever. There's really no way to confirm the diagnosis except by agreement among people. So 2 psychiatrists or 2 psychologists both say, yes, I think that's what it is, and then that's why you get the label. But you do have situations where, an email I got from a parent saying, why can't they agree on this stuff? The school said they have this condition, then the primary doctor said, no, it's this condition. The psychiatrist said it's a 3rd condition. The external psychologist said it was a 4th condition. Can't they agree? They often do not agree. That's one of the scary things about mental illness is you can have a different diagnosis from different people that you see, which means that if you go in because you are mentally ill, and I think several of you that I see out there probably are, just kidding. But if you don't like the diagnosis you get, go see somebody else, right? They could probably give you a different one and you'll be happier. So what's the cause of mental disorders? I think we can rule out evil spirits. Although there's still some people that would prefer that as what's going on, and then all you need is exorcism and you can be cured. I wouldn't go that route myself. And by the way, mental illness is real. I'm not suggesting it's not real. It is a thing. And there are schizophrenics, and there are people with bipolar disorder, and there are people with major depressive disorder. Absolutely. It's just I want to show that the way we diagnose these things is a little wacky. There's certainly a genetic component to most, if not all, mental disorders. We know there's the problem is we know it's genetic. We haven't been able always to identify the gene. For example, for autism, there's something like 28 genes they're looking at right now to see if one of them or some of them or in combination they're leading to autism. So we're a long way from still pinning down exactly what the genetic mechanism is, but we're pretty sure it's in a person's genes. That doesn't mean it's not also a biological kind of condition that can result from illness, physical illness, or other kinds of biological conditions that a person might have. Also very psychological, obviously. Something's wrong with the way the person's thinking and feeling and behaving. There's a psychological component that probably results in mental disorders, as well as the environment. We don't know how many toxins that we're exposed to, for example, but we also know that having experienced child sexual abuse very frequently leads to mental disorders as an adult. If we could wipe out child sexual abuse, we would probably eliminate a lot of the mental illness that we see out there in society. So I'm all about trying to do that. I haven't figured it out yet, but I'm on it. The way genetics has developed, we've moved into this idea of epigenetics. And very simply, epigenetics is the way they've learned how the environment turns on or turns off certain genes. So certain things get attached to genes, and the environment triggers those or doesn't trigger them, and they can lead to different mental disorders. So we used to say, is it biology or environment, physiological or environmental? It's a combination. So you may have the gene for some disorder, but because you grow up in a very healthy, happy environment, it never gets triggered and you don't develop the disorder. A lot of the diagnoses are made by behavior checklists. For example, there is an autism behavior checklist, which I'll refer to later, and it's just a list of behaviors, and you go through and check them. And if you check enough of them, the person has autism. It's not a really good instrument. There are others that are more sophisticated and done by extensive interview. But again, they're basically looking at, does this person show the behaviors that we know are part of autism? Check, check, check. It goes back to our expression, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it probably is a duck. And because you can't, well, I can't hardly read it myself, but it's in English. I feel depressed, no interest in activities, have weight loss, insomnia, am tired, and think about suicide. We put all those together, and the therapist there, I diagnose you with depression, I would too. You've got all those symptoms put together, unless you can come up with a different explanation as to why the person might be experiencing those. I showed the slide yesterday, and so I don't have to go through it again, but sometimes it does seem like certain kind of diagnostic categories become popular at different times. And clearly autism is extremely popular. And I don't, there's debate about why we see this increase in autism diagnoses. And is it because we have more people with autism, or is it because we've changed the way we diagnose them? I'm on the side that says we've broadened the category of what used to be called autism. We've broadened it to bring more people into the fold. I think that's the major explanation. There's pretty good research to support that. So if we tighten it, I knew, or I haven't seen him in years, but a psychiatrist named James Harris, who studied under Leo Kanner, who's the person who first defined autism. And Harris is one person who would stand up at every meeting I was with him at and saying, Leo Kanner would not call these people autistic. You know, that we've just changed the diagnosis way, way too much. So why do we even diagnose mental illness? It should be a guide to treatment. Okay, if you have schizophrenia, we should have this specific treatment for that. If you have bipolar disorder, you should have this specific treatment for it. If you have autism, should be that specific treatment. Unfortunately, our treatments aren't that specific. And some treatments that we think are pretty good for one disease don't work on somebody else. You know, so it works for some people, not everybody. It's still much more of an art than a science when some practitioner is trying to help a person receive appropriate treatment. So that kind of begs the question as to, do we always need to provide these additional diagnoses if they don't lead to any different kinds of treatments or understanding? All right, so come on, Tim. Can people with CHARGE have mental illness? I mean, it's a statistical thing. Yeah, of course. I mean, I can't tell you that no one with CHARGE people are completely immune to mental illness. That's great. Nobody's immune. But I don't think that it's typical. I don't think it's common. I don't think it's what we really should anticipate. Because they have, it should never be, because they have CHARGE syndrome, therefore they are more susceptible to mental illness. I just do not believe that. Because they have CHARGE syndrome, are they going to display some behaviors which might look like mental illness? Yes, we do see that. We just think they're better explained by CHARGE and the sensory impairments and the vestibular problems and all the other medical conditions that they experience, as opposed to having a separate mental illness. So why not just diagnose it? Well, does it lead to better treatments or outcomes? Now, autism is often, it may not be true here, but certainly true in the United States, that if you get the autism diagnosis, suddenly insurance will cover a bunch of different treatments that you can't get without the diagnosis. And so when a parent says to me, but Tim, I want the diagnosis so we can get some special treatment, go for it. I mean, I'm not going to keep you from getting treatment that you might want, right? I mean, when Jacob was little, we had to diagnose him as severely cognitively impaired in order to get a subsidy of $200 a month from the state. I said, go for it. Yep, give him the label. That's great. We want the $200 a month. But I didn't really like having that label attached to him. But and that's the same thing here. I think it's unfortunate that anybody would deny services to a person because they don't have the right word written down on their chart. And the other problem, of course, is the diagnosis even accurate? And in CHARGE, I don't think it is. Would we expect the same behaviors which are covariant? This is an interesting question. Which are covariant in mental disorders for people without CHARGE to be covariant in people with CHARGE? So go back to the covariant kind of thing. So I'm sniffing my nose and I'm coughing and my eyes are running, scratchy throat, say probably a cold. But would those be the same symptoms in a person with CHARGE to show a cold as they are in a typical person to show a cold? I believe they would be. When we get to something like autism, for example, would you expect the same behaviors that we use it to define a person without CHARGE as having autism? Would we expect the same kinds of behaviors to occur in a person with CHARGE who is autistic? And I don't have an answer to that, but I suspect not. So in other words, what would a disorder such as autism look like in a person with CHARGE? And we don't know. Or if a child with CHARGE is said to have autistic-like behaviors, does that mean they have autism? And that's kind of the critical question. Just because you show those behaviors, does that mean you necessarily have autism? So, I've got to move on here. So autism. These are the two major characteristics of autism. And you can think about your kid. Impairments in social communication. Okay, they're not very good with social communication. And you're probably familiar with some of the kids, I mean, name badges, do they love these things? Right, so they're coming up, looking at name badges. That's not something I do. I mean, I glance at it. I try to be kind of casual about it, but they're not casual about it. And then they'll start a conversation. Hi, Tim, what color is your car? What color is your house? I mean, it's like awkward, right? So obviously autistic, right? No. Maybe it's possible, just possible, that it's hard for them to see these kinds of things. It's also just possible they don't understand the reactions they get from other people because they don't kind of perceive those very well. Or maybe if you've got a world in which the vestibular system is all screwed up, nothing stays quite constant, so you can really study it and figure out what's going on there. There's much better explanations for the lack of good social communication. Like social reciprocity is give and take. Okay, in real autism, we knew a guy with very high functioning autism, and the people he was living with would say to him, when you're talking to other people, it'd be nice if you asked them questions about themselves. He said, why would I do that? I'm not interested in that. Yeah, but it shows, so he learned to do it. He got, so tell me about, but it wasn't coming from him, it was coming from what he was being taught. It's very, very unreal. So social reciprocity can be a problem. It's a problem, in autism is a problem for our kids as well because they don't understand relationships terribly well. Nonverbal communication deficits. Okay, problems with understanding how my nonverbal behaviors are affecting somebody else. Sure, we got that. Lack of understanding of relationships. Check it off. So, clearly autistic. Okay, then restricted repetitive behaviors or patterns of behavior, interest, or activities. Do our kids get hung up on one thing? Yeah, I've seen that here. It's really, really kind of fun. I mean, we met with, appropriate to say, but okay, I'll just, one kid this morning who wants to be rich, and that's all he can think about right now is how to become rich. I love it, because I think it'd be great. I think he could become rich. He's got that kind of a mind, but that's all he wants to talk about, right? Now, I got hobbies too, and I have interests, but I know enough about social relationships I shouldn't spend all my time talking about it. Although I was criticized by I have an adopted brother who's about 10 years older than me, and I was visiting him recently, and the second day he said, "Tim, all you do is talk about CHARGE syndrome." I said, "Well, I'm interested in it." And you kept asking me questions about it. So maybe I'm autistic. Let's talk about the insistence on sameness. Do some of our kids want things to be same all the time? Absolutely. But if things keep changing, what happens? I lose it because I can't figure out where things are. I may be tripping on stuff. I mean, lots of good reasons to want sameness. Fixated interest, we kind of talked about. Oh, reactivity to sensory input. Yeah, if you've got sensory deficits of various kinds, you can be highly reactive to certain kinds of sensory stimulation that actually gets into your system. So you can check it all out, but is it really autism? I mean, autism's been associated with, again, lots of different syndromes. I should turn this, well, I turn my page. Like Cornelia de Lange syndrome, Fragile X syndrome. However, there's a debate about whether the profiles that they call autism in those syndromes are identical with typical autism. A person who only has autism. And I'll just show this quickly. In Fragile X syndrome, they've learned that social anxiety, extreme shyness, and eye gaze avoidance are typical, but they're not central to autism. And there's a strong willingness to engage socially with others. So why does almost everybody with Fragile X get diagnosed with autism? I can't answer that one either. In Cornelia de Lange syndrome, the nature of repetitive behaviors appears to be different compared to those with basic autism. And in tuberous sclerosis complex, the repetitive behaviors are not as frequent as in autism. And this is what we're trying to do, is be able to describe the behaviors unique to different syndromes. As soon as you call them autism, the syndromes disappeared. I did one study a long time ago, and I used these autism behavior checklist because I was curious as to whether kids with CHARGE would measure having autism using the checklist. And I discovered when I looked at the manual for the measure that it had norms or standards to compare against a deaf-blind population. It wasn't necessarily a really good representative sample of deaf-blind, but at least it was there so I could see, are our kids more like autistic or more like deaf-blind? The answer, of course, is that they were like neither, which I thought was really fun. So the top line, which you ought to be able to see, is autism. And this is for the different subtests down here, which are less important, except for one of them I'll mention. And then you have the bottom line is deaf-blind. Autism is the yellow line in the middle, and it just doesn't follow the same pattern. They have done this with norms for cognitively impaired, same pattern. Emotionally disturbed, same pattern. CHARGE, different pattern. I love it because I think our kids are so unique, so incredibly special. But one thing, the second area there is relating. And our kids, on average, were better at relating than the kids who were deaf-blind and exclusively and the kids who had autism. And you see that too. I mean, I said they're socially awkward, but that doesn't seem to stop them, right? They're still extremely socially interested. They're just kind of immature in the way they go about it. So I'd like to think of our kids as unique and not at all autistic. So I'm going to bring up David now to talk a bit more about this.
First, I had to do that because it's supposed to be there, and it fell down this morning. And I've been sitting there with high anxiety thinking, I can't present until this is correct. And I'm not joking. This was very important to me, and now everything is good. Now the easy thing is presenting. We're going to be changing a lot in these sessions, so Tim and Shanti and I will come and go in a complicated way. And it worked once, so maybe it will work the second time. I just want to go back to a slide which Tim showed two or three slides ago. 3 slides ago. The title was Autism, and he said the list was social reciprocity, non-verbal communication deficits, lack of understanding of relationships, stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, insistence on sameness, fixated interests, and reactivity to sensory input. And I've gone back to it because all those things are very characteristic of deaf blindness. They're also very characteristic of CHARGE syndrome. And this is partly where our problem comes from, is that if you look at the behaviors of these different groups of children, they can look very, very similar. The problem is, once you see the behavior, you need to investigate the cause of the behavior. And that's when you see that CHARGE is very different to autism. And CHARGE fits much better with deaf blindness as a label. If you want labels, deaf blindness is a much better label than autism. But people go for autism, and we'll explore why. I'm not used to co-presenting with people, so I get in a terrible mess through feelings of high responsibility. If I was on my own, I wouldn't care, and I could just say anything. And if it didn't work, it would be my fault. But now if it doesn't work, it's Shanti's fault and Tim's as well as me. I've been in the field of deaf blindness and CHARGE syndrome for 35 years. And almost every child I've ever met has been diagnosed as autistic by somebody. The diagnosis may be done very professionally by a doctor or a psychologist, but the diagnosis is also made by teachers and social workers, by parents, grandparents, the mother's best friend, the lady who lives in the house next door. All these people diagnose autism. I'm sure you've experienced this. A few weeks ago, on one of the CHARGE Facebook pages, a mother sent in a little piece of video of her son who was about 2 or 3 years old. And she said, "My son is beginning to flap his hands like this when he gets excited. Does anyone else do this?" And instantly, a parent responded, "This is a sign of autism." And I won't get angry today. On Thursday, I got very angry. And I'm going to be very calm today because I've worked on it over lunch. But when I saw the comment, I was very angry because of the stupidity of jumping in with such a definite statement that was complete rubbish. The statement made no sense whatsoever, but it could do a lot of damage to that other parent and to the child. Flapping the hands is a strong characteristic of human beings, and that's all we can say. We can discuss when they do it and why they do it, but to say it only happens with one particular medical or psychological or clinical label is complete nonsense. And we know children with CHARGE flap their hands, and we know why they flap their hands. We don't have the slightest doubt about it. And we know that it's an adaptive, functional behavior. That usually it serves the function of helping the child to calm down when they are excited or angry or anxious or frightened of something. And if you observe the child closely, you see a change before they flap their hands and after they flap their hands. And usually after they flap their hands, the shoulders come down, the breathing is a little better. Sometimes there may even be a little smile because the hand flapping has served a very, very direct function. That's the way that we need to look at children. Not to have a list of labels and a list of behaviors, and if the child does one of the behaviors, we say, that's autism, that's mental retardation, and so on. We now have learned enough about CHARGE to explain ever such a lot of the things that people with CHARGE do. We've come a long, long way in 35 years, and we still need to keep exploring, but we know an awful lot. And anyone who looks at CHARGE for a while, anyone who reads literature, who goes on the internet, should realize very quickly that the kinds of behaviors which are typical in children with CHARGE come from a different place to the same behaviors in autism. It's very clear, and I find it difficult to tolerate people making an automatic diagnosis of autism when they see those behaviors. Now I'll get back to the presentation. I think deaf-blindness or multisensory impairment is the best label to use if you want a label along with CHARGE syndrome. It's a good one, because our philosophy in the deaf-blind world, the way we approach children, the way we educate them, the way we look at them, and the way we teach them is a really good fit for everybody with CHARGE syndrome, in my experience. If you go with the autism label, the way people look at children with autism, the way they evaluate them, and the way they teach them is usually not a very good fit with children with CHARGE syndrome. Sometimes, if you're very lucky, an autism program can work quite well. But in most cases, I know it hasn't been a good match. The child has not done well, and in many cases, certainly in the United States, the program itself has said fairly quickly, we don't think this is good for the child. We don't think this is the right place for them. The basic problem, I think, is that autism is very famous and CHARGE isn't famous. Autism is very popular and CHARGE syndrome isn't unpopular because nobody's heard of it. It's just, it doesn't register with people. So they are looking for autism because they read a magazine article, or they saw a TV program about it, or they know somebody they see in the supermarket with a child with autism, and they do things like flap the hands, or they hyperventilate, and they know that's autism, so they think the child with CHARGE who's doing it, it must be autism. And we've all the time got to fight to advocate for the children to spread understanding of this condition, because we now have understanding of CHARGE. We've put a lot of time and energy into developing the understanding. So it's a case of similar behaviors in many cases with very different causes. And in CHARGE, the primary causes are sensory impairments, along with multiple medical interventions, drug therapies, and those things all come together to create these distinct behaviors. But to assume that the two conditions are the same or very similar because of the behavioral outcomes doesn't make sense. It's completely crazy. I've been told that the reason I believe this is, I was told directly last year, oh, David, you believe this because you're not very familiar with autism, which is true. And I said, no, I believe this because I'm very familiar with CHARGE syndrome. Believe me, I'm way more familiar than you are with CHARGE syndrome. So I know what I'm saying, and I know what I see when I look at the children. I can understand that for some parents, getting a label that they're more familiar with, like autism, can be quite comforting. possibly. I do know parents who, when someone gives them the label of autism for their child, they're really pleased about it. Maybe they have a friend with a child with autism, or in the class there's 1 or 2 other children with autism, and suddenly their child isn't this strange charge syndrome person. They're someone with autism like other people you know, and it creates that feeling of togetherness. That used to be the case, but now, thanks to organizations like this, thanks to the conferences, more than anything, I believe, thanks to Facebook, parents no longer feel so isolated. And all the time on Facebook, we get parents suddenly appear and they say, my child was diagnosed yesterday. I've never heard of CHARGE, but I found this page. And instantly they're into our world of CHARGE syndrome, and very few parents leave that world. And what's been interesting, even if it's a family where the child with CHARGE subsequently dies, many of those families remain in the CHARGE world because it offers support and a feeling of companionship on many, many, many levels with an intense emotional involvement and commitment. As Tim said, if your child gets the label of autism, does this change what we do? Does this change the way we think about the child? I would say if your child has CHARGE and then you get the autism label and you think of your child in a different way, that probably means you weren't doing it right before the diagnosis of autism. I don't think that diagnosis should change the way you think about the child. Unfortunately, what it often does is take attention away from CHARGE syndrome and put it on autism. And the great thing about autism is, as Tim said, you can say, oh, this is autism. And then everyone says, autism. And you've ended the conversation. If you say CHARGE syndrome, they say, what's CHARGE syndrome? And instantly you can become like Tim, talk about it for 2 days, and then realize they've left the room and you need to relax a little bit. And I think that's the biggest problem with this confusion, is that once you give a child with CHARGE the label of autism, autism takes over. Autism jumps to the front of everyone's mind, and the incredible complications of CHARGE syndrome disappear. There are too many, they're too complicated, there are lots of difficult words, there are lots of difficult medical things to consider. It's much easier to just say autism, because if it's autism, you don't have to worry about their heart, you don't have to worry about their breathing. No one ever dies of autism. So it's a much more attractive label in many ways, and it diverts attention away. And we've seen this in many, many schools, where as soon as they know it's autism, they think they know exactly what to do, and you start to get big problems coming along. There is an issue of, as Tim mentioned, access to services. In the United States and in the United Kingdom, if you get the label autism, you are eligible for more services than if you have the label deaf blindness. I know that in other countries represented here, it's the other way around. There were people here from the Netherlands yesterday, and they said, no, you want the label deaf blind because you have far more services in the Netherlands than the label autism. But in the United States, it's very obvious. Parents want the label because then their child can get speech therapy and therapeutic swimming classes, but they won't get those things without the autism label. And it's a problem because children should get services according to their need, and we discover their need through specialized professional assessment, not through giving them a label. And if you put the label on them, you may well end up giving them access to services they don't need, but they've got the label, so they get the services. So we feel that CHARGE, the theme of this first session is that CHARGE is enough. Charge is so big, charge is so complicated that we really don't believe there is any other label at all that you need to bring in. It's a complete misdirection in trying to work with the child. Now I'm going to hand over to Shanti, who's going to go through other labels that are often confused with charge.
Hello. So like David said, I'm going to be discussing some more mental health disorders, labels that are often given to individuals with CHARGE, especially in the United States. Before I start, I'd like to say that we could spend an hour talking about each of these disorders. So I'm going to try and be as clear as possible, but I'm not going to be able to cover everything. And so if you have any questions on anything that Tim or David has already spoken about or what I tell you today, please come and see us and ask us more questions. Hopefully we'll have time at the end as well. I'd like to start with obsessive compulsive disorder, also known as OCD. This is similar to autism. This is a very common diagnosis given to individuals with CHARGE syndrome. OCD is an anxiety disorder that is marked by two very distinct behaviors. One is obsessions, and the other is compulsions. Obsessions are reoccurrent, very persistent thoughts that an individual has that are intrusive. The individual can't stop them from happening. They have these thoughts. They're unwanted. The individual does not want to continue thinking about this, but they keep coming back. There are two things that people try and do when they have these obsessions. They either try and ignore them, or they try and engage in some kind of behavior or a compulsion to make the thought go away. And compulsions are, again, those behaviors, and often they're repetitive behaviors that are aimed at trying to get at the fear and anxiety that's caused by the obsessions in order to make it go away. Some obsessions that are common with OCD include things like concern or fear obsessions about germs or getting sick. And so an example of a compulsion for that would be washing your hands. But instead of just washing their hands once, they may wash their hands 10, 20, 50 times just because they have this obsession, this fear with getting sick. There are lots more examples of different types of obsessions. They're not all about germs, but that's a very common one. We believe that most individuals with CHARGE syndrome do not have true OCD. Someone with OCD has very irrational thoughts. If someone coughed across the room, someone with OCD might get concerned that they're sick and go wash their hands several times. That's, in general, an irrational thought if someone is coughing way over across the room. And the treatment to that is usually exposure to that irrational thought and preventing them from engaging in the compulsion, preventing them, say, from washing their hands over and over. What we would like to suggest is that individuals with CHARGE syndrome don't have irrational thoughts or fears. They have true thoughts and fears. They're dealing with an abnormal amount of extreme circumstances, such as chronic pain, such as a lot of self-regulation concerns, such as difficulties with engaging with their environment because of deaf-blindness. And all of those things lead to true and understandable anxiety. And so some of the repetitive behaviors that they might engage in have a purpose, have a function. There's a reason for them, and they're not irrational. Here are some examples of some of the repetitive behaviors or OCD-like behaviors we've seen in CHARGE syndrome. There's a lot of everything must be just so, everything must be just right. This includes ordering or lining up objects, light switches, either having all the lights on at one time or all of the lights off, making sure that doors are closed or open. Another thing we see quite commonly in what we've, at least for me, I've had parents talk to me about a lot, is repetitive question asking. What are we doing next? Where are we going? And even having that same question again and again and again. Similar to what Tim was talking about earlier. What's your name? What's the color of your house? And then they ask you that same question again and again. So these types of repetitive behaviors are what people in the United States are seeing, and they say, here's these repetitive behaviors, they must have these irrational thoughts, and then they diagnose them with OCD, instead of looking at the experiences that individuals with CHARGE go through and realizing that they have a lot of sensory impairment. Not only are they dealing with blindness, not only are they dealing with deafness, but also a lot of vestibular concerns, a lot of balance concerns, and a lot of difficulty with regulating emotion. All of these things lead them to find innovative, creative, sometimes solutions that we would never even think of to controlling the true anxiety they're having due to, again, chronic pain or multisensory impairment. We'd like to say, again, I think Tim and David mentioned this earlier, we're not necessarily saying that individuals with CHARGE syndrome cannot have OCD, but we think it's very unlikely. We think it's far more likely they have true anxiety, and they've come up with very creative responses to dealing with it. The next disorder I'd like to talk about is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This is also known as ADHD. It's also very commonly given to individuals with CHARGE. ADHD is a disorder that deals with inattention or inability to attend to a particular task and inability to control one's behavior, so they're getting hyperactive or moving around a lot. There's two major types of ADHD. One tends to be more focused on inattention, inability to attend, and the other includes that hyperactive behavior. These are a couple lists. Nope. Here they are. These are a couple lists of what those behaviors might look like. So on the left, some of the inattentive behavior, such as lack of attention to detail, inability to follow through on a task that might have several steps, difficulty organizing and focusing on particular steps of a task, being easily distracted or being forgetful. Some of the examples of more of the hyperactive behavior including fidgeting, being out of their seat, often on the go or unable to play quietly, and difficulty stopping themselves from interrupting, so maybe blurting out in the middle of a conversation. When we look a little bit more closer, we can try and see how these behaviors, if we see them in an individual with CHARGE, are better described by CHARGE syndrome than ADHD. A lot of it, we feel, has to do with deafblindness. If it's difficult to see what's going on in a classroom, for example, if it's difficult to hear the teacher, it would be a lot more difficult to pay attention to the lesson or to complete a task. If the individual is having troubles with balance and isn't well supported in their seat, they may have missed some of the instructions a teacher has given or their parent has given, and it may seem like they're being inattentive and not focusing, when instead they're just dealing with multisensory impairment. There's also some difficulties we've seen with executive functioning, which really include difficulties with attending to focus tasks and organizing activities. Again, self-regulation and those sensory needs really seem to be the basis of ADHD-like behavior in CHARGE syndrome. Here's an example of a child who is engaging in behavior, and we can look at it from an ADHD perspective versus a CHARGE syndrome perspective. Bradley, a third grade student with CHARGE syndrome, never seems to be paying attention during math. He spends math class staring up at the lights or inspecting his fingers close to his face. An ADHD perspective would be that Bradley's unable to attend. He's also very fidgety with his fingers and might be more hyperactive. However, a CHARGE perspective would look more at the fact that Bradley may not be able to see the board. He may not be able to hear what the teacher is saying or what his peers are saying about the math lesson. When Bradley's flicking his fingers in front of his face, it's not because he's fidgeting, it's because he's trying to get some visual sensory input, which actually might help him be able to attend better to what the teacher is saying. And Bradley has a hard time transitioning, so maybe he needs some more support when they're transitioning into a math class. The next disorder we'd like to talk about is borderline personality disorder. This is one of many different personality disorders. It's not, personality disorders overall are not very commonly diagnosed among individuals with CHARGE syndrome. However, we have seen this diagnosis given a few times, and so we wanted to talk about it just briefly. Individuals with this disorder often have difficulties and instability in their interpersonal relationships. They have concerns and issues with creating a self-image and difficulties with mood regulation and impulsivity. I'd like to note that a large concern for these individuals is often a fear of abandonment, which has to deal with their lack of self-image and difficulties, again, with those relationships. However, individuals with CHARGE syndrome who are deafblind, perhaps, having a fear of being left alone is a real fear. I've heard parents even bring that up as a big fear for them, that their child would be left alone somewhere and not have someone to tell them where they needed to go. This often comes up for individuals with CHARGE syndrome because of their difficulty with social relationships and interpersonal relationships. But as Tim and David talked about earlier, this has a lot to do with their sensory impairment, not necessarily because they have difficulties being social. And so we don't feel that this is a very good label for individuals with CHARGE. Tic disorders. Tics are involuntary movements or times when individuals involuntarily will blurt out certain words or sayings. There are two types, verbal and motor. Tourette's disorder, which is a particular type of tic disorder, has both of those types of tics. It's worsened by stress, anxiety, and excitement, and also being tired. And we know that a lot of individuals with CHARGE deal with all of those things on an everyday basis. In general, tics are fairly common in children, but they're fairly transient, meaning that by adulthood, many of these children will grow out of having these tics altogether. There has been some research that shows that individuals with deafblindness deaf individuals may have more difficulties with these kind of behaviors, or these type of behaviors are being misinterpreted as tics when they're actually adaptive or helpful for the child and useful for self-stimulation. Next is oppositional defiant disorder, also known as ODD. The diagnostic criteria for this is an angry, irritable mood, being argumentative or engaging in defiant behavior, and vindictiveness. When looking at how this could better be explained with CHARGE syndrome, we can see that communication difficulties could really be a cause of it. If it's difficult for individuals to express what they need or want in a particular situation, it makes sense that they might engage in more defiant behavior or aggressive behavior to try and get the person to know what they need. Additionally, sensory impairment can also lead to more defiant behavior. Again, if they're not able to know what's going on in their environment, if they're not able to express their needs, it may lead to more of this kind of behavior. Executive functioning difficulties have also been shown to cause some of these ODD-like behaviors in individuals with CHARGE syndrome. And lastly, when there's fatigue, when the child is dealing with a lot more of exhaustion, this could lead to more defiant behavior. It's very important to note that the vindictiveness that's a key piece of ODD is not very commonly seen in individuals with CHARGE, which again sets this disorder or label off as not one that's very helpful for individuals who have CHARGE syndrome. Additionally, all children at a certain age go through a stage where they have some more defiant behavior when they're trying to be more assertive. Individuals with developmental delay, though, this stage may start later, this stage may last longer, and so those are some things you have to keep in mind when you're thinking about an individual with CHARGE who may be dealing with developmental delay, that normal kind of stage of being assertive and engaging in some defiant behavior might be extended. Also, it's really important, and we'll talk about this more in our next talk, to consider pain as a possible underlying cause or reason for defiant behavior or an angry, irritable mood. When individuals are in pain, it makes sense that they may engage in some behaviors that are upsetting or frustrating to other people. Here's an example of how ODD or how behaviors of a child could be seen as ODD or could be looked at as within an individual with CHARGE syndrome. Julie was eating pureed peas for dinner when all of a sudden she scooted back her chair and threw the bowl of peas on the ground. An ODD perspective was that she threw the peas on the ground to be defiant, to defy her caregiver. However, from a CHARGE perspective, we may be able to find some more reasons behind why she scooted back and why she threw the peas on the ground. Perhaps she was having some gas pain and she was trying to express to the caregiver that eating right now was hurting her stomach. Perhaps she doesn't like peas and this was her way of communicating that I don't really like this food, I'd prefer something else. Perhaps the texture wasn't right or the taste wasn't right for her. Yes. And lastly, the texture. Again, this is a way, perhaps, instead of just being defiant, Julie is trying to express what she needs, what she wants, or maybe the fact that she doesn't like the texture of the peas. The last disorder I'm going to discuss is bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder. It's when individuals have two very distinct, sometimes, states of emotions and feelings. One being a mania, which is a kind of heightened state, and the other being depression, which is a lower, sadder state. So individuals having a manic episode may feel very high, up or elevated. They have a lot of energy. They feel jumpy or wired. They may have trouble sleeping. They may be agitated, irritable, and they feel like their thoughts might be racing or they're going very fast. Additionally, individuals who are in a manic state engage in some risky, sometimes irrational behavior. Individuals who are having a depressive episode feel sad, down, they have less energy. They have, again, trouble sleeping, or they feel like they may sleep too little or too much. They feel worried and empty. They have trouble concentrating, and they feel tired or slowed down. When looking at these kind of behaviors that look like bipolar disorder, we can see a lot of similarities to things that individuals with CHARGE may be dealing with on a daily basis. However, this again has to do with their CHARGE syndrome and not necessarily bipolar disorder. We know, for example, that lots of individuals with CHARGE have trouble sleeping for a variety of reasons, whether it be pain or difficulties with light or difficulties with just falling asleep. We also know that individuals with CHARGE syndrome have difficulty sometimes regulating their emotions. And so this may look like bipolar disorder. I'm actually going to pass now to Tim. He's going to speak a little bit more on the regulation of behaviors.
Do you have some days when you have lots of energy and you get lots of stuff done, and then you have some days when you feel kind of lazy, like you don't want to do anything? If you're saying yes, you're bipolar. You know, it's very easy to throw these diagnostic terms around when, you know, they're really describing certain extremes in human behavior as opposed to something that's totally unlike regular human behavior. And we think about the reactivity that Shanti was talking about, especially in bipolar. I mean, you do have these periods of time when you're full of energy and all sorts of ideas and all sorts of things that you can accomplish, followed by the days when you're kind of down. And I think one of the ways to think about this in a charge kind of friendly framework through a model that was developed by Winnie Dunn. She's an occupational therapist, trainer, professor at University of Kansas Medical Center. And in Winnie's model, she's looking at the reactivity that we have to our environment. So there are times when the environment's very, very stimulating, and times when the environment is not so much stimulating. But even in very stimulating times, we can tune things out. Give you an example, the projector up there is making a lot of noise. Most of you have probably ignored that noise, particularly with your earphones on. But for some people, in a very hypersensitive situation, they can be driven crazy by that. I remember studying for an exam years and years ago in the library, and there was a guy behind me who was in another seat, you know, banging his pencil on the table. If I had been a violent person and doing the typical American thing about carrying a gun, he'd be gone. It never occurred to me to change seats, which probably was the same thing to do. So what her model shows on the left side is there's a threshold of reactivity. So there are times that we habituate to everything going on around us and don't even notice it. Sometimes you probably all live in pretty busy households. Are there times when you can tune out everything, including your kid with charge, and just nothing's happening? It's great. Or other times when one more little thing going on drives you absolutely wild and crazy. And that's when you're highly sensitized. Okay, so I'm experiencing all these sensations. I can't sort them out. Other times, got nothing going. Do you ever see those extremes in your kids with charge? You know, I could take Jacob, my son, into a very noisy environment, and he can only handle that for a short period of time, and then he's underneath the table over there, you know, trying to bring down his arousal level so that he can calm down again. But there are other times when he is clearly going around the house trying to increase his sensory level and get things going. Okay, and these are the typical kinds of ways that we regulate ourselves. So when we're habituated, we just tune everything out. That's the way we respond. When a highly sensitized situation, we react highly to the stimuli. Or we can regulate by going against those. So in a highly habituated situation, we may become sensation-seeking and run around, make wild noises, jump up and down, do something to get things going. Or in a highly sensitized situation, we may try to avoid it by crawling into a corner, going into bed and covering our heads up with the sheets to bring everything down. I think this is typical human behavior, but I think with charge, the change from habituated to highly sensitized, or vice versa, can occur within seconds or even nanoseconds, or if there's something quicker than nanoseconds, I think, you can see sudden change. Did I talk about Jacob in the bush yesterday? I can't remember what I talked about. So, Jacob, raise your hand if you've heard this before, okay? But Jacob, I take him for walks, and there's this particular bush that he liked to get to. I mean, we'd see the bush, and he'd start walking really fast, which normally he did not do. He liked to stop at every bloody tree. And he was not only a tree hugger, he was a tree licker. But this bush was okay, because we'd get over to the bush, and he'd start feeling the branches of the bush, really nice. But all of a sudden, I could never pick up the transition point. His face was down in the bush. He's ripping at his face. He's making wild noises. What happened all of a sudden? This nice sensory experience suddenly changed. And now it's a horrible experience that he can no longer control himself in. And I think it's these kinds of behaviors that we see in CHARGE, which lead the ignorant people out there, stupid and ignorant, to quote David Brown, to make these diagnoses of something that they're obviously crazy. No. When you are spending your life trying to manage your sensory systems in different ways than the rest of us have to, right? Although as I get older, I'm getting more and more deaf-blind, I'll figure this out myself. But you're processing it differently, and you're transitioning differently. And so I think it's very understandable that our kids behave in ways that seem peculiar to others. Why would you have your face down in a bush and scratching at your skin? Well, because you're nuts, or you have CHARGE syndrome and your sensory system is very hard to control and manage. Yeah. One of the things that concerns me a lot is how these behaviors lead to psychotropic medication. And there's several reasons why I'm concerned about that. One is that these medications to control behavior and emotions, call them psychotropic, have not been generally researched on children. Okay, they were developed for adults. But we're using them on kids. The kids have been becoming the guinea pigs for these medications. Now, why should it matter whether it's an adult or a kid? Well, dosage is obviously one thing, right? What should be the right dosage be for a kid? Nobody knows. But another thing is kids' brains are still developing. Mine's atrophying. It's going the other direction. But these kids' brains are developing. So what's the impact of messing with the neurotransmitters in their brain like dopamine and serotonin when they're still growing? Nobody really knows because we don't have the data to see how effective these things might be. Even where we have the data, like we know that certain medications are very good for ADHD in children, we still don't really know what the long-term impact on their brain is. We're living experiments. We have no idea how these medications impact sensory systems. Because all these medications assume a typically developing person, more or less, with intact sensory systems. They can see, hear, the vestibular system is just fine. Even think about the balance issue. Some people in taking psychotropics have problems with balance, have problems with sleep as a result of the medications. Our kids already have those problems, and now we're heaping the medications on top of them. Makes me very worried. They have numerous side effects, these medications. There are none of them that don't have side effects. You will generally be told, well, keep using them for a while and the side effects may go away. But if they don't start going away, the typical response is to add a medication to help control the side effect, as opposed to take you off of it. And that's why people end up on 2 and 3 and 4 different medications at the same time, each trying to control for something that wasn't dealt with the first drug or the second drug or the third drug. Another problem is being prescribed off-label. What that means is that medications were developed and approved to treat certain kinds of conditions. Risperidone, I don't know what it's called over here, but it's a medication developed to treat schizophrenia. It's used heavily for CHARGE syndrome. I see so many kids who are on this medication. That's not because they're schizophrenic. It's because the psychiatrist thought, well, you're showing some of these odd behaviors. Let's try this one. Or someone's heard that their friend is on risperidone and they say, well, my friend's taking it, so well, maybe we'll try that with your kid. I know so many parents then who suffer through the side effects of a really horrible medication. If you're schizophrenic, I think you should probably have it. If you have CHARGE syndrome, I'm really scared by how many kids are taking that medication. But that's off-label treatment. So medication was developed for this condition is used for something else, just in case it might help. And there's a tendency to add drugs, as I said before, rather than to replace them. Also, the goal of every psychotropic medication should be to get the person off of it. You want to control the behavior, and when the behavior is well controlled, then you use lots of other kinds of interventions, which are not medically based, and we'll talk about some of these in the next session, to try to help the person then get off the psychotropic medication and be able to be sustained behaviorally with just the behavioral interventions. But that is not what happens in my experience. Is you get on the medication, that's yours for life. And if it's not working very well anymore, let's double the dose. Okay, something that people don't think about. Doing there. At least I haven't fallen down. One of the things that people don't think about is that, and we've said this many times in different contexts, and I know we already said it here, and we'll say it again, all behavior is communication. Okay, the way I know what's going on with my son Jacob, because he's non-vocal, is by his behaviors. Certain behaviors are pain behaviors, and you see him do them, you say, oh, that's the pain behavior, right? Other behaviors are, I'm in a pretty darn good mood. That's particularly when the croaking starts. That tends to be a good sign. He's enjoying himself. So we read all these behaviors and we say, okay, now I know what's going on with him because I can see how he's behaving. That's his major form of communication. I mean, yeah, he's got some others, as I mentioned before, with the cards and the gestures and a few signs, but it's reading his behaviors. If I drug him to get rid of a behavior, what have I done? I've taken away a major source of communication. And yeah, there's certain behaviors of his I do not like, but I trust them because they tell me something is going on with him. Get rid of those, and now I have no idea. When Shanti was talking about tics are highly related to stress. So now I know that my kid is under stress because I can see the tics. Okay, now I'll do something to try to remove the stress. Oh yes, the tics are going away. I've reduced them by reducing the stress in the person's environment. Very, very helpful. Drug it away, I don't have that opportunity anymore. I do have to say, though, that sometimes a drug is survival for the family. I don't want families who are all about to whole split apart or be diagnosed with mental illness themselves individually because of the behavior of their child. I don't want that to happen, right? You know, your sanity is worth something. So if your sanity is preserved by giving a small dose medication to your child, which helps control their behavior for a while, you may have to do that. I mean, it's weighing things, but no family should be torn apart by the behavior of their kid if a medication would help keep the family together, okay? So I do recognize there are extreme situations in which it may be necessary, but then I would really encourage you to find a way to get other kinds of interventions and be able to back off the medication. All right, I'm going to bring up David for the last few slides.
Thank you. So I'm going to finish the first session fairly quickly. When we were designing this presentation, we were very anxious because we're covering a very big topic and a very complicated topic and quite an emotional topic in a short time. And there are many ways you could do this presentation, and I hope the way we are doing it is meaningful to you and helpful to you. We think the second part is much better than the first part. It's more interesting when we talk about possible ideas for remedies and for solutions. What can you do about all these things? But the presentation began with our concerns about the use of wrong labels and how often the wrong labels are being put on children with CHARGE, and then other problems come because they have the wrong label. So I talked about deafblindness or multisensory impairment. And you might be sitting there thinking that your child with CHARGE isn't really deafblind. Maybe they wear glasses and they have a hearing aid, but they hear you speak and they speak. And deafblind or multisensory impairment is a very broad label, and it covers an incredible range of sensory functioning. None of us has perfect sensory functioning anyway. With age, our sensory functioning starts to disappear, and Tim and I are discovering this. Every 2 years, we talk about the bad things that have happened to our sensory systems. But also, our sensory perception abilities change when we get tired, when we get hungry, when we get distracted. None of you is seeing and hearing as well now as you were at 9 o'clock this morning. And none of you is controlling your body now as well as you were at 2 o'clock. You are all smaller than you were at 2 o'clock. It's a very interesting phenomenon. Now some of you are big again, but it won't last because it takes more and more energy and attention to maintain a good posture. So when we say deaf-blind, don't be quick to think your child isn't deaf-blind. People with CHARGE have multisensory impairments. Very, very few of them probably don't. But about 99% of people with CHARGE have multisensory impairment if we look at function. So the eye doctor may say the eyes are perfect, no problem. And the audiologist may say the hearing is good, everything is fine. But there are likely to be all sorts of other issues in a child with CHARGE which will stop their functional vision and their functional hearing from working normally. All the senses are designed to develop at the same time, simultaneously. And in CHARGE, that doesn't happen because one sense or two senses or three senses or four senses or five senses or seven senses are all damaged in some way and are not working properly. And some will develop more quickly than others, and that has an impact on all the other senses. So if the child has normal eyes, but their vestibular system, their semicircular canals are not working properly, the child will not have normal functional vision. Because normal functional vision doesn't just depend on your eyes, it depends on your vestibular system as well. You don't see with your ears, but the ability to use your eyes, especially when things move or you move, needs a good vestibular system. And if you don't have that, you're going to have vision problems, and you will then have to do something about it. And it goes with all the senses. So I think multisensory impairment is a good label to think about and stick it with CHARGE. If you could be in your child's body, if you could be them just for 2 minutes, you would probably, within 30 seconds, you would ask to go back and be you again. I think you would be absolutely shocked and probably very frightened at what it is like, because you have normal sensory functioning, to suddenly feel and live what it's like for your child would be a huge shock. And I wish we could do that. I wish we had virtual, they say virtual reality. Well, it can't do that. I think virtual reality is useless, personally. I'm not a tech person, but I wish we could really be the child to get an idea what they're dealing with. And I think all of these children are dealing with greater difficulties than we understand and that we see, not least because they have brilliant skill at adapting things so that they can work as well as possible to do the things they want to do. And of course, it's to do the things they want to do, not to do the things you want them to do necessarily. And sometimes the way they adapt is not great for you. Sometimes it's a bit dangerous and you have to stop it. We'll talk about that in the next session. But I think we always need to credit the creativity of the children. We see it all the time in all the children, whether they're 1 month old or 30 years old. We see functional adaptive behaviors, which they have discovered. Nobody's taught them. They do it themselves because they can think, they can experiment, they can remember what worked and what didn't work, and that becomes part of their established system of being. And I think, last slide, you can tell it's time for a break for me. I can see it's time for a break for you, which is why I'm not looking at you anymore. By all means, if you want to go with autism, if you want to say my child with CHARGE has autism, that's fine, as long as you always remember that any way of looking at your child, any discussion of your child happens in the world of CHARGE syndrome, because CHARGE is much more important than autism. It's always going to be more important, and you mustn't let anybody push CHARGE out of the picture because they want to look at autism and they know about autism. And that happens a lot, and you have to make sure that CHARGE syndrome creates the environment within the discussion. CHARGE syndrome provides the focus for interventions and teaching strategies and for assessment. And we think CHARGE is enough. We think CHARGE is so big, we think CHARGE is so complicated that there's absolutely no point looking for other labels and other explanations. Is there anything in CHARGE that stops you being autistic? No, we don't think so. So maybe you have CHARGE and autism, but nobody could tell. If somebody can tell, they're a fraud, in my opinion. They're guessing, and they can't prove it, though they will try and argue. Is there anything in CHARGE that stops you being autistic? No. And is there anything in CHARGE that makes you autistic? No, we don't think so. But there's no point worrying about the autism label unless that label will get you much better services or earn you lots of money, in which case, maybe take the money. And remember, your child has CHARGE syndrome. That's the most important thing. So now you have a break, and after the break, we will talk more about strategies, but very quickly and very superficially. We're not going to give you the answers, but we're going to give you a look at many of the things, mostly from the world of deaf-blindness, but also from other fields that we think can be very helpful with this population.